In this video, we're going to talk about fractions, decimals, and percents. Let's consider this square. Now, this square happens to be a 10 by 10 square, which means that there are 100 little squares represented here. And I see that several of them are shaded blue. And if I wanted to count how many blue squares there are, let's do that really quick and then talk about how we could represent that as fractions, decimals, and percents. Okay, so since this is a 10 by 10 grid, that means that each of these are tens. So both sides represent 10 each. So from just the sides, I have two tens, okay? But then across the top, it's also shaded. However, I'm going to exclude the corners because I already counted those. So that's 9 and another 9 right there. So that's going to be, let's see, 18 plus 20, so 38 so far. Okay, now let me just go ahead and total up what we have here in the middle. So this is 6 squares and another 6 squares. And here we have 4 and another 4. So that's going to give me 20. Okay, so far totaling those two will be 58. And then the middle, that middle square right there, that's just going to be 4. All right. So add 4 and that'll give me 62 squares. Okay. So counted them all up. And of course, you don't have to kind of keep track of it like this. I just did that for the video so you guys can see what I was looking at. So this is the number of shaded squares. And there are 62. Okay, so what's really nice is that because there's 100 squares, it actually makes sense right away to think of this as a percent, because a percent is always out of 100. And kind of thinking about that, sorry, that like looked a little bit weird, always out of 100, that means that this would be 62%. Easy. Okay, but I actually think that a decimal is really easy to think about too, because these often are used as what's called decimal squares. And since there's 100 of them, we could also think of this as a 100th square. And since 62 are shaded, then as a decimal, it would be 0.62 because that is the hundredths place. All right. So percent and decimal, pretty easy. In fact, I probably could have just converted the percent to decimal because we've done that before. So if you convert the percent to decimal, you're just moving the decimal twice, and that gives you 0.62. Okay, so that's a nice, easy thing to look at. But for fraction, that's actually not too hard either. Fraction can always be written as a part of a whole. And since we're talking about, here, let me just kind of squeeze it in right next to it. Since we're talking about 62 out of 100 pieces, I can write it like that. But whenever I'm working with fractions, I typically am wanting the reduced form. So let's go ahead and reduce this fraction. I definitely can divide both of them by 2. So 62 divided by 2 is 31 out of 50. And that's as reduced as that's going to be because 31 is a prime number. Well, there you go. I've written it as fractions, decimals, and percents. So these pictures, these squares, 10 by 10 squares, actually make it really easy to convert between fractions, decimals, and percents. Okay, so let's try an example. But this time, we're going to shade the square. And let's say I want to shade, let's do a fraction. I think that'll be the most fun. 3/5. 3/5 of the square. Okay, now I could break this up into fifths. I could like divide it up into fifths. So here, I could do that by just kind of every 2 rows. I could kind of break them up into fifths. So each of these represents fifths, and then I could just shade 3 of them. Cool. So that would represent 3/5. There's another way of thinking of it. I could have taken the 3/5 and times it, times the 5 by 20. And the reason is that would give me 100. So 3/5 is equivalent to 60 out of 100. And then I'm like, cool, now I just need to shade 60 of them. And here, this time I'll do it with a highlighter because at least it'll look a little bit better. So I would shade 6 of the rows or columns. I mean, it doesn't really matter how I want to shade it. In fact, here, I'll make it a little creative. I'll shade the first 3 and the bottom 3. Why not? I can do what I want. And there we go. That represents 3/5. Okay, so it also represents as a fraction, as a decimal, I could think of that as 0.60. And then as a percent, I don't know why I erased the work I showed on the fraction. That was really weird. 60%. Okay, so we can easily convert to the other 2 based on just kind of having one of them to work with. I would say that there is a third option for this, and this kind of leads me into the last little bit, and that's taking a fraction and rewriting it as a decimal or a percent. So let's start by rewriting a fraction as a decimal. Let me come back to the problem we just were looking at, 3/5. So if I wanted to write this as a decimal, I basically just need to divide. I need to take 3 and divide it by 5. That's what the fraction represents, is that division. Which if I wrote it as a division, it would be the 5 on the outside, 3 on the inside. And of course, we're like, well, 5 doesn't go into 3. That's true. But what we do is we add a decimal and a 0. And we bring the decimal up, and then we say, okay, instead of treating it as 5 into 3, we're going to treat it as 5 into 30. And 5 does go into 30 6 times. And done. So there it is. This is the decimal 0.6, which is the same as 0.60, right? Same thing, just dropping the extra 0 there. And there you go. Now, I showed the division, but you're allowed to use your calculator. So why don't you grab your calculator and let's look at 7/8. Let's divide on the calculator. 7 divided by 8. I'm going to put it into my calculator. Pause the video if you need to grab it and put it into yours. And I get 0.875. Well, I can now convert both of these into percents very easily. Here, I'm going to switch pen colors then. So as a percent, that would mean I take the decimal and move it 2 places to the right. So as a percent, this is 60%, which we knew. Oops, sorry. It's a little bit sloppy there. There we go. Here, I'm taking the decimal and I'm moving it 2 places. So it's going to fall in between the 7 and the 5. And that's going to give me 87.5%. Now, the only ones that get a little bit tricky are the fractions that potentially don't end. So let me give you a famous example. Let's look at 1/3. Grab your calculator, put 1/3 into the calculator. And what you'll get is 0.3 repeating. Or if I were to write it out, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, and so forth. Okay, it keeps going, ... forever. If I wanted to write that as a percent, I have a little bit of a problem because I'd have to round, and that's possible. I could round my answer. So in other words, if they say to round to the nearest tenth, what they mean is once we move the decimal, so once we actually take this decimal and move it twice, we'll have a tens place. So that would leave me with 33.3%. But there is an alternative. Because technically, once I move the decimal, I still have 3 repeating forever. That means you could represent it as 33.33%. In other words, this is the same fraction we started with. So we could use it in our percent. For us, mainly we will round, but it is possible to write it as a fraction. And if you were to see this, you could just take 1/3, put it into your calculator and get 0.3333 repeating and be able to convert it to a decimal without any issue at all. But those are really the only ones that are troubling. And for the most part, we're going to round. I just realized I wrote neart instead of nearest. That's really funny. Haha. Let's fix it. Okay, before the video is over, let me erase, please. Of course, my computer is wanting to fight me. There we go. Nearest 10th. There we go. All right. Yeah. So we usually are typically going to round our answers, but it is possible to have fractions within the percents. And I just wanted to kind of show you an example of that, but don't get hung up on it.